So I need to break my silence on something. And I know it's going to upset a lot of people. Basically, there's some issues that no matter what you say, you're going to alienate yourself from 50% of the people involved in the conversation. And especially these days, then we've become so hyper-polarized that we're not able to see eye to eye on some topics. But like I say, I've got no choice. I've got to break my silence. So the other day, someone left a comment on a new video I made. And they basically said, well, why are you wasting your time making videos complaining about the world? Why don't you do something useful? Take your smartphone and go to Gaza and take some pictures and inform the world about the terrible situation there. To start off with, I have to say that there must be very few people in the world who are not aware of the situation in Gaza. And there are also very few people who are not emotionally invested in the situation on one side or the other. It's one of those things. You're either for or against me and my views. That's a big mistake in terms of the spiritual path. Now, if you've watched a few of my videos, then you will see that I've actually covered this point in a previous video. And so if you're interested in that, then please click on this link. Because I discussed the issue of Gaza and my feelings of it in a very brief form. I'd said that if I had the skills and the ability, then I'd quite like to help in these kind of places where people are so desperate. And the situation is incredibly desperate. But there's a problem. And that's because I returned to Canada from the East in order to look after my elderly parents. My father is 92 years old, and my mother, who is 85, is chronically ill. So I'm not in a position at this time just to pick up sticks and abandon them, go somewhere else. It's not like I haven't thought about this. So I'm going to share a secret with you. And I've only told a few people about this. About 2 years ago or so, then I was in the monastery in Namo Buddha in Nepal, in the Himalayan mountains. And we learned that Putin had invaded Ukraine. And also that the Russian forces were doing horrible and unspeakable things to men, women, children, the elderly, and waging a completely unjust war against these innocent people. Now, this really affected me deeply. And in general, then I don't really get upset or fight back when people attack me personally. But I find it very difficult to tolerate bullies. I find it intolerable when people prey on the weak, the disenfranchised, and use their position of power to mistreat these people who are deserving of our loving compassion. And so this has got nothing to do with Buddhism, about being a monk. This is personal. And so what I did, upon hearing this news, is I made a plan. And that was, as soon as I was able, to travel to Ukraine and to become a combat medic to help out on the front lines. Of course, this would mean giving up my monastic vows and my robes. It's a sign that I don't have the view of non-duality, I don't believe life is an illusion, right? I'm affected by these things. And my belief in reality and my belief in duality meant that I was compelled not just to sit on my ass, but actually to do something about the situation. So I planned everything out. How I'd get there. I looked for training in automatic weapons in Delhi and to try to find a place where I could buy body armor and whatever was necessary, first aid packs, etc. I could bring with me. But I had a problem, and that's because having been in retreat for so many years, then my debit card had expired. And I needed that in order to make these purchases, get an airline ticket, get training, buy stuff in Delhi. Anyway, so it was something I needed to sort out. I started exercising. I've been meditating for years. I was out of shape. And I tell you, if I had my debit card, if I had access to my funds in my bank account in the UK, then I'd probably already be there. I'd probably be dead by now, or I'd be on the front lines. Anyway, before I was actually able to sort things out, then I got the call. My mother was in hospital, both my parents had COVID, and it became apparent that I had no choice but to return to Canada. And so I finished my work and I jumped on a flight and went with a small bag, carry-on bag, returned to Canada after all those years. And when I returned, my plan was, as soon as my parents were well enough, then I would fulfill my promise or commitment and try to go and help out in the war in Ukraine. But pretty quickly, it became obvious that there was no other option but to stay and to look after my parents. I made the commitment, I made a promise to them, and I couldn't abandon them. So since then I've thought about what I could do. For example, when my brother comes to give me respite care, then I could go to the Ukraine for a couple of weeks and do some volunteering. These options are still open. But I'm not free. I'm not free to go to Gaza. I'm not free to go to Ukraine. I'm not free to go and do something proactive. And I understand this position where people think, why do you Buddhists just sit on your butts meditating? Why don't you actually go out and do something? Well, here's the thing. You can spend your whole life going out in the world and trying to deal with the temporary sufferings that people experience. Everywhere, right? There's landslides, floods, earthquakes, wars. It's not like the situation in Gaza is the only time that people have been oppressed and under siege. This has been going on for millennia. Humanity has continued to engage in intense negativity and perpetuate hatred and violence. And so you can chase around from one situation to another all your life, but you're not going to solve the world's problems this way. The only thing will happen is, eventually, you'll burn yourself out. And when you're dead and gone, then 100% there's going to be more suffering, violence, warfare. Now the Buddha asked the question, why is the world like this? And if the Buddha, who was of such great ability and intelligence, found that the solution was that he needed to get off his backside and go out and give aid, then he would have done that. But what he realized was this wasn't the solution. The problem isn't that there aren't enough people going out and helping others. The fundamental problem is, as long as we've got our negative emotions, then there will be suffering in the world. And so, in order to end the suffering of the world, then one has to start from here and remove one's own anger, and greed, jealousy, pride, and ignorance. I have to share something with you. This has got nothing to do with the Buddha Dharma. It's got nothing to do with being a monk. This is personal. I am a lifelong pro-Palestinian. And throughout my life, I've found their plight to be a source of great sorrow. As I said, it's intolerable. The Palestinian people, especially the people of Gaza at this moment, are without refuge. They have nowhere to go. They can't even cross over the border into Egypt. They're trapped. So anyway, what did the Buddha have to say about this kind of thing? Well, many people think that the Buddha taught absolute pacifism, taught that under no circumstances you should ever get involved in violent confrontation. So what we need to do is we need to look at what the Buddha taught to gain some understanding of what his position was. And one place we can look is at the Vinaya, the rules that the Buddha gave. And there we find a clue about how he would view these situations. The unlawful invasion of Ukraine, the subjugation and the murder of the Palestinian people in Gaza. What the Buddha taught was, if your country was invaded, let's say you were invaded, and then the king or the government called people up to defend your freedom, then it was your responsibility to do that, and that you weren't allowed to run away to the monastery and become a monk, but you had to fulfill your responsibility to your country, to your community. So in that, we can see that the Buddha believed that it was our responsibility to defend our people and to defend the truth, to defend the downtrodden and disenfranchised. It's true that once one has become a mendicant, a monk, then one shouldn't engage in violent conflict. In fact, we're not even supposed to talk about war and politics. And that's because somebody who has gone forth, a mendicant, is somebody who has left the world behind, who seeks only liberation. But having said that, then it's quite obvious that from time to time, then monks do get political. They do become politically active. And we see this recently, for example, in Burma or Sri Lanka, where we have politically protesting monks. Also, the Tibetans are no different. Many Tibetan monks engaged in protest against the Chinese rule. Not only that, when the Chinese invaded Tibet, then many thousands of monks gave up their robes and took up arms to defend their country. It's not like they all just lay down and waited for their people to be overrun. They had to do something about it. So that goes to show that Buddhists aren't necessarily complete pacifists. In fact, many Buddhist scholars say that it's a Buddhist's responsibility to defend truth and justice, especially to defend the Buddha Dharma. That teaches the path to freedom from suffering, teach the path of liberation. The Ukrainians have a right to defend themselves. The Palestinians have a right to defend themselves. But also, the Israelis have a right to defend themselves. But where we go wrong is we develop resentment or anger. The greatest danger to the Ukrainian people is not hypersonic missiles and Grad rockets. In terms of the Buddha Dharma, the greatest danger to the Ukrainian people is if they give rise to resentment, if they become radicalized by the war, and then they themselves start mistreating the Russians, if they dehumanize them. I mean, this is what happened to the Jews. They'd been so badly treated for so many centuries. And then in Europe, in World War II, then the most horrific atrocities were perpetrated against their people. They were treated worse than animals. Where the problem comes from is that we give rise to resentment and anger, and we seek revenge. And this is where we go wrong. And it's not like the Buddha is going to judge you and put you in hell if you seek revenge. The Buddha taught the law of karma, cause and effect, the law of causality. It's not like some kind of mystical force, as if the cosmos is going to seek retribution against your actions. It's merely that actions have results. And what has perpetuated the suffering of the Israelis and the Palestinians alike is their mutual hatred. Our hatred and our resentment perpetuates the violence and the suffering of their people. What's taught in the Way of the Bodhisattva, the seminal text on bodhicitta by Shantideva, is that all suffering arises from self-concern, and all well-being arises from concern for others. And this is it. This is the key point in the Mahayana Dharma. If everyone in the world was motivated by altruism, then there would be no problem. Of course, we're still going to get sick. We're going to die. There will be natural disaster. But that itself is not what causes us to suffer. What causes us to suffer is our selfishness, our lack of humanity, our lack of love and concern for others. What you have to understand is, I'm not anti-Semitic. I'm not against the Israeli people. In fact, I have a vested interest in their history. And that's because in my own family, on my mother's side, we have Jewish heritage. It's quite common that hundreds of years ago, when European Jews came to Quebec in eastern Canada, and because they suffered such great discrimination, that many of them converted to Catholicism. And this is my own history. From my grandmother's side of the family, they were Jews who came to Canada, and the history of anti-Semitism that was propagated mostly by Catholics and Christians forced many of them to give up their faith and to take up the Christian or Catholic faith. So I have a vested interest in this story. I understand how easy it is to resent the past. But what the Buddha taught is that what matters is not what happened in the past or what might transpire in the future. The most important thing is how you conduct yourself here and now, and especially whether or not you have these feelings of love and compassion, this wish for all beings to experience well-being and to be free of suffering. And it's when we lose this that the world becomes a worse place. When we lose our love and compassion, then we become radicalized. We become radicalized by our anger and our greed. So I know that by releasing this video, I'm going to upset a lot of people, make some enemies. My wish is that everyone should achieve well-being and happiness. And then on top of that, if possible, make progress on the spiritual path and achieve what is called final awakening and liberation from samsara. But that's not an easy thing to do. The very basis of all of this is that we should learn to develop love, understanding, caring, and compassion for others. And it's by this that the world will become a better place. I mean, it's everyone's right to hold their own position. I don't agree with Zionism, but it is my belief that a Zionist has the right to their opinion. But they don't have the right to impose that on others. For example, here in Canada, we have a Sikh separatist movement. They're looking for independence, for an independent Sikh nation to be formed in India. But actually, they're a minority. In terms of the global Sikh population, they're a very small minority. So they have the right to hold their views. They have their right to promote their belief that they deserve an independent nation. What they don't have is the right to impose this on others. Then it's very easy for both sides to blame each other. Many people blame the Israelis for the situation in Palestine. Many people blame the Palestinians themselves. This blame game doesn't help in any way. But really, the fault lies with us Europeans, lies with humanity in general, because we think we can artificially change the world. For example, redraw borders. I mean, just think. In China, there's a group of people called the Hakka. And traditionally, then they've been nomadic for many, many centuries. So just imagine what would happen if we said, well, we're going to form an independent Hakka nation in China, in mainland China. Now, how is the CCP going to react to that? For example, if we said we were going to give immigrants coming to the United States their own state, hand it over to them, people would be up in arms. They'd never accept it. So really, it was the Europeans, and primarily the British, who decided to artificially transplant millions of European Jews to the Middle East. But the Palestinian people at the time had no voice of their own. They had no power. They were simple goat herders, etc. They had no say in the matter. And it's understandable that we had this desire to reconcile the Jewish people for all the suffering that they had to undergo at the hands of powerful European nations. I mean, anti-Semitism was rife in Europe at the time. And to this day is prevalent even here in America. So there was this wish to make good. It's natural human foolishness and ignorance that we think we can change the past, and also that we can plan for the future. As I said, the most important thing is how we act here and now, and especially our motivation. And that we keep our humanity. As Jesus Christ taught, then it's our responsibility to care for the homeless and the downtrodden. Anyway, I'm going to get myself into trouble. And I think I've said too much already. So I'm going to leave it at that. And until next time. And see you later.